Welcome to Introduction to Acquisitions. And this is the first in what I hope is going to be kind of a series on webinars and training sessions related to acquisitions. We get a lot of questions about it, and it is a very complex part of Evergreen. So today is going to be our very basic introduction. It's going to be very foundational, but as we move along to other sessions, we'll get into a little bit more detail. So as Benjamin said in the chat, feel free to ask questions in the chat at any point. It may be a situation where I say, we're going to get to that in a couple of minutes, just be patient. It may be a situation where we can address it right away, but please feel free to stop me and ask questions as we go. So I wanted to start by talking a little bit about who this audience is for. And I definitely see that we have a few people here that I know are already working with acquisitions, and that's fantastic. We are going to be looking at this sort of from that really starting point though. And so our main audience is going to be either libraries looking to adopt the Evergreen acquisitions module. So you haven't done it yet, but you're kind of curious about it. You're thinking about doing it, but just haven't taken the plunge yet. Or libraries who've maybe recently adopted it, but haven't fully figured out how to use it. And so you started playing around with it, but you're not quite there yet. Additionally, staff that maybe have recently taken over acquisitions duties at a library that already uses it. So, if your library is fully entrenched in acquisitions, but you are new to that role, then hopefully this will help you kind of gain an understanding of kind of how each different tool within acquisitions fits together. And none of this is to say that if you don't fit these categories, that this session won't have anything for you. Seasoned acquisitions professionals who are joining us today can expect to learn something, I hope. And honestly, I'm glad you're here because there may be points where I could use your expertise. There may be a question that I don't feel totally confident answering, but some of the people in our audience might be able to help out with. So all levels of acquisitions expertise are definitely welcome today, but I wanted to classify that the main audience was sort of beginners at this point, just so that you have an idea of what to expect moving forward. This really is meant to be a foundational session covering the very basics of acquisitions, really kind of looking at it holistically and how it really kind of fits together as a cycle, not to dive too deeply into any one aspect or any of the details of working with anything. I'm going to go ahead and stop my video so I don't distract myself with talking. So that being said, this is going to be the first of several sessions. And so just looking ahead on the horizon, we will be getting into those details in future sessions. We'll have one on the administrative setup piece. We'll have one on the daily workflow piece. We'll probably have one on the end of year process. And then for those of you who are looking to adopt acquisitions over the next fiscal year, our hope is to have some sort of hands-on setup workshop for you as well once we get closer to that point of adoption. As for today, specifically, we're going to cover general information and tips. We're going to be talking about the basics of administration, the basics of the daily workflow, and then have time for questions. But before we do any of that, I want to start with the most basic of all the basics, which is what is acquisitions? And I was actually hoping that before I start talking about what I think acquisitions is, I was going to invite everyone to put in the chat what they think acquisitions is. If you were asked to create a definition for acquisitions, what would that look like? Just take a minute to throw it in the chat, and then we'll go from there. Purchasing new materials to add to the library's collection. All right, selecting materials, ordering, invoicing, tracking funds, very much. All right. Any other answers, throw them in there. I'm going to go ahead and start talking about what I think it is, which is basically what Mary and Dustin have already said. And that's the process of selecting, purchasing, and receiving collection materials. That's the most basic version of acquisitions. And every library engages in this, no matter how informal the process is. So even if all you do is buy books off of Amazon with a P card, your county controller pays that card each month and you never even have to do paperwork for it, it's still acquisitions. Gives me minor heart palpitations to think about doing it that way, but it's still acquisitions. But on a slightly more complex level, I think most libraries would also agree that acquisitions involves the underlying budgeting and fund management related to the purchase of materials. So acquisitions is buying materials, but it's also managing the money that is used to buy those materials so that you have sort of a process involved. And this is something that I think most libraries also engage in. You know, that can be to different levels. It could be a series of spreadsheets to something really, really complex that maybe you work with your municipal government on. But it's generally, I think, a really important part of the process that you know where your money's coming from and how much of it there is. More specifically within Evergreen, when we talk about acquisitions, we are talking about a set of integrated features and tools that help libraries to facilitate these processes. So the processes of selecting, purchasing, and receiving, as well as managing your budget and funds, and then to integrate them with other parts of the ILS, such as cataloging. And if you already have a process for selecting, purchasing, and receiving collection materials, and a process for managing your budgets and expenditures, then Evergreen basically allows you to automate some of those processes and to basically make them communicate together a little bit more effectively. And then it also helps a lot with that integration piece, with getting them into that larger workflow of your library. The Evergreen acquisitions module can be roughly broken down into two different categories. And these two different categories map pretty much exactly to the first two bullet points up here. You've got the administration, which is the budgeting and fund management, and you've got the daily workflow, which is the selecting, purchasing, and receiving materials. In addition to automating some of those basic processes, Evergreen also does a lot to integrate how acquisitions fits into the rest of your library. Obviously with collection development, but also with circulation, with cataloging. And so in order to really make the Evergreen acquisitions module as effective as it can be, it's really important to bring people from different parts of your library into the conversation and planning for it. So that's one of the things we'll kind of come back to over and over again today, is the idea of getting that buy-in from additional people and making sure that as you plan ahead, you're considering how acquisitions fits into the other aspects of your library. But I did want to talk a little bit about some of the perks of making this transition. One of the things, obviously, is that it's going to track budgets and it's automatically going to debit funds for purchases. So when you purchase something, then you don't have to do the process of going in and you know, subtracting that money from your spreadsheet or anything like that. Your funds are going to be automatically encumbered once you've put in that purchase order, and then they're going to be automatically debited once you mark them as received. So that really takes away the chance for error. Another thing that I think is really useful, and not every library uses this, but if it is something that you feel like would work well in your situation, I think it's a fantastic feature. And that's that you can add on order items to your catalog right away as part of the ordering process. So, you know, you don't have to do a separate step of pre-cataloging anything. Basically, as you're ordering things, you can make it so that they show up in the OPAC and patrons can find them and place holds on them as soon as they're listed as on order. And I think that's really useful. It also allows you, depending on the vendor, to streamline your communication with them. And we'll talk a little bit about EDI today. We won't go into great detail about it, but basically EDI is one of the tools involved in the Evergreen acquisitions module that allows you to communicate with your vendor directly within the ILS. So, if your vendor sends you a message that a book you ordered is going to be delayed, instead of having to make sure that you get that from your email and then go into your spreadsheet and mark that something's going to be delayed and then make sure that the money's not going to be debited until a future date. As soon as your vendor sends you that communication via Evergreen, all of that work kind of automatically happens, which I think is a really nice feature. Now, this doesn't work with every vendor. Amazon is a big one that it does not work with. So that's, I know that's a big one that a lot of libraries use, but it is really nice for those that it does work with. One thing also that I think is really helpful is that it provides the opportunity to improve communication between selectors and acquisition staff. So if you're in a really large library or a really large system where you may have selectors in a lot of different branches, a lot of different departments, and then that all sort of goes to a central acquisitions person to do the actual purchasing, going through Evergreen helps to streamline that communication between those different groups. And it also allows selectors themselves to communicate well together. Even if they're at different branches, maybe even different counties, they can use selection lists within the Evergreen acquisitions module to communicate about what they plan to buy and to ensure that they're really spending their money wisely in a way that is going to best meet their patrons' needs, instead of sort of each working siloed and then getting that to the acquisitions purchaser. And so there are definitely a lot of opportunities to just kind of improve that communication. And then one that I think is really important is that it really integrates cataloging into the acquisitions process so that as you are purchasing things, you're also automatically moving your MARC records into Evergreen so that you can begin cataloging as part of the purchasing process. And so that's another area where you really are kind of streamlining some steps. So those are that's my sales pitch, I guess you could call it, on why you might want to make this transition if you haven't already. If it's not right for your library, then it's not right for your library. But I do think that it has a lot to offer. So if you do decide to make the transition, or if you've already decided and you're already there, but you're trying to figure out how to get started, a couple of tips for really getting ready to lay the groundwork for this. A big one is to plan ahead, just in general. Know where your money's coming from. Know every different eventuality of how you spend things, and really have a good overview of how acquisitions is happening right now and how you'd like it to happen. Determine what features you need and implement those. There are a lot of tools within the acquisitions module in Evergreen. And not all of them work for every library. Not every library uses the selection lists. Not every library necessarily uses EDI to streamline communication with vendors or anything like that. Some libraries only use it for EDI, and any vendor without EDI, they don't use the Evergreen module with. So what's really important is that you figure out what your library needs and which tools help you to meet those goals, and only worry about those tools. If you're leaving some things behind, it's okay. You're welcome to come and ask us questions about, is there a reason that I should be using this that I'm not seeing? And we're more than happy to help you figure out how it could be useful for you. But overall, what's really important is that you figure out what you need and you figure out how to make the module work for you, rather than try to do everything and get overwhelmed and decide that none of it's right for you. Another thing to keep in mind is that you can use different workflows for different vendors. You don't have to create a standard one-size-fits-all workflow of exactly how you order and receive things every time. If vendors work differently, you can have different workflows for those vendors, and you can make acquisitions basically fit whatever situation you find yourself in. And one last thing, this seems like something that you wouldn't need to think about before getting set up, but I think it is important to keep in mind that reports are going to be really useful when doing acquisitions. They'll definitely be useful when you come to the end of the year process, but they can also help you just get kind of snapshots throughout the year. So as you are getting set up, one person to bring in may be the person that does a lot of your reporting. So if you have, branch managers are the people who run reports every month or something like that, bring them into your conversations as you're preparing to get started with acquisitions and talk about how reports are going to be useful for you. That's definitely a person that you at least want to make sure that they know what your plans are, so that when you start asking for all these different reports that they've never done before, they're prepared for that. So those are just sort of my quick tips. Any questions about any of that basic stuff before we really move into things? All right, so we're going to start today by talking about the basics of administration. So remember, we've got sort of two different facets of acquisitions. We've got administration and we've got daily workflow. We're going to start with administration, and that's really the management of your money. So I have it here as a cycle. I think it's actually more accurate to say it's a little bit more of a four-leaf clover, but that was hard to do. So it's a cycle. And that really starts with setting up your funding sources. This is where your money comes from. So whether you have one pool of money that comes from your county government and that's it, or you have money from your county government plus a couple of grants, plus maybe some donations, plus things that are raised by the Friends at the Library, and maybe an endowment. No matter how many different places you get money from, you need to account for each of those individually as a single funding source. So every single one of those sort of funding bodies needs to go into Evergreen as a funding source. Once you've set up your funding sources, so every different place that you may get money from, then you set up your funds, and this is where your money goes. So a lot of libraries may set up a fund for adult materials and a fund for juvenile materials, or they may go even deeper and say, we're going to do juvenile fiction, juvenile nonfiction, juvenile DVDs, and juvenile audiobooks. Same thing for adults. You can have as many or as few funds as you need. The key thing to keep in mind is about basically how much do you generally spend for each of the areas that you are calling a fund, and make sure that you're sort of prepared to send that money into that fund, because one of the key aspects of all of this is sort of distributing your money from the funding sources to the funds. So once you've set up the spot where your money comes from and you've set up the places where your money will go, the next thing you need to do is make sure that there is actual money to transfer between those things. And that starts by applying credit. So this is the money that you get from your funding sources. So you're going to apply credit to your funding source. Basically, let's say your county government gives you $30,000 a year. So you'll have a funding source of county government, and you will apply $30,000 of credit to that funding source. Now, after you've done that, you have to take that money, that credit, and allocate it out to funds. And so you're going to allocate money from a funding source to a fund. And what's really nice is that you can take money from 5 different funding sources and funnel it all into a single fund. You can take money from one funding source and funnel it across 5 different funds. You can really make the money kind of go lots of different directions. But the key thing is knowing where it's coming from and knowing where it's going. So let's take a really quick look at this. I'm not going to go through all the process of setting up funds and allocating money or anything right now. That's something we'll get into during our administrative session. But I just want you to kind of get an idea of what it is you're looking for. And I have a feeling that that probably did not show up in my screen share.
We're seeing the fund administration?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. There we go. Is everybody seeing Evergreen now?
Yes.
Okay. So from here, we're going to take a look at some different things that exist within Evergreen. So we are in the funds tab right now. So the fund administration interface allows you to kind of work within 3 different things. We're not even going to talk about fund tags today, but it allows you to work within funds and within funding sources. So you can see that right now there's 1 fund for us to work within for Cardinal, but under funding sources, we've got 2 different funding sources. So theoretically, we've got money coming in from our county budget office and money coming in from our Friends of the Library. And if you look over here, you can see that our county actually hasn't given us any money. We're just hoping that they will, I guess. But the Friends of the Library have given us a total of $2,000. And of that $2,000, we have allocated $1,000 to a fund. So if we click on Friends of the Library, then we can get more details about this. We can see when this allocation or when this credit was applied. We can see how long we have to spend it. That's typically going to be our fiscal year. And we can also see a note about it, which is that it's from our annual book sale. Now we can apply more credits. Let's say the annual book sale did better than expected, and we actually got $2,500. We could apply additional credit. And then we can go into the allocations tab and we can see the fund that credit was allocated to. So remember, in that basic screen, we saw that $1,000 had been allocated. Well, in this tab, we can see where that allocation went to. So $1,000 was allocated to the 23 test fund. So I can click on that, and this is going to bring me into details about that test fund, where I can see how much has been spent. I can see, how much is encumbered versus how much has actually been debited. I can see the total amount that was allocated and how much is still here. So just a very brief overview of funds and funding sources and kind of how they work together. The key really is that it is funding sources are where your money comes from. Funds are where your money is spent. Credit is the money that you're given, and allocations is the money that you plan to spend. Okay, let's get back into all right, so we should be back into the slideshow now. So one quick note.
Still seeing fund administration.
Really? Oh, I didn't. There we go. We should be good now.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. All right. So we're not going to spend a lot of time talking about providers, but I did just want to give a really quick note about what EDI is. I mentioned it already a couple of times, and it's something that you'll definitely want to think about as you are moving forward with deciding whether or not to set up acquisitions. And that's basically EDI stands for Electronic Data Interchange. And that is the tool that allows you to communicate with your vendors directly within Evergreen. You can send purchase orders to them, you can receive invoices from them, and you can also receive messages from them that will help you to update statuses of books and things like that, help you to cancel things, and help you to claim things. And so this is really useful, but it's unfortunately not available for every single vendor. So as you are doing your setup planning, one of the things you'll need to think about is what are the vendors you work with? And then, actually going into Evergreen and seeing if you can figure out whether or not they're already in there, talk with your vendor, see if they do EDI, because that's going to affect how you work with them once you switch over to Evergreen, is whether or not they do EDI. So what do you need to do to plan for your administrative setup before you actually go in to do it? What do you need to know? So the first thing you need to know is where your money comes from. What are every single funding source that you have? Then you need to figure out, where does your money go? What are the different fund areas? If currently you do not classify into different budgets, then it may be a good idea to at least get an idea of the different spending areas that you have. So you can decide whether you actually do want to set up different funds for each of them, or if you want to stick with just a large fund that you pull off of. This is not a necessary step, But since you're looking at this stuff anyway, it might be a good time to think about, are you spending your money where you should be? Are you spending thousands of dollars on juvenile audiobooks, but only circulating 3 of them? This is a good time for that type of kind of audit to go on. Another thing to think about is, when do you spend your money? Do you spend it kind of evenly throughout the year? Do you spend it a little bit here and a little bit there, and then in one big burst at the end of the year, or one big burst at the beginning of the year? Figure out kind of what that looks like. There are some tools available in Evergreen that allow you to kind of set up safeguards for making sure that you don't overspend, and you can use that to ensure kind of even spending throughout the year. So if that's something that you do or that you'd like to do, knowing about it ahead of time will help you to set it up when you're setting up your funds. And then the final question is, who's going to be involved in all of this? Who is currently involved in acquisitions? And are there other people that you need to bring in as you are setting this up? One group to bring in, and they're often already part of the acquisitions process, but they are not in your library, definitely bring your catalogers into the conversation, because acquisitions and Evergreen is definitely integrated with cataloging, making sure that they know what you're doing and they know how it's going to affect their workflow is really important at this stage. So just kind of make sure that you have all the involved parties front of mind, and that they are all part of this conversation as you move forward. All right, so that's the basics of administration. Before we go into looking at navigating and then talking about sort of the daily workflow, are there any questions about administration? All right. Well, let's talk really briefly about navigating. And most of what we do with navigating we'll do live, kind of as we're going through the daily workflow stuff. But just a couple of notes that I wanted to bring up beforehand is that most of the navigating you'll do will come off of the acquisitions menu in Evergreen. So if that is not something you have explored before today, I definitely encourage you to just kind of go through that menu and click on all of the options and see where they take you. Most of the navigation will be done from a single search page, which is basically just, it's called the general search under the acquisitions menu. And from there, you can search all of the different pieces of the daily workflow. So we're going to talk about the daily workflow. And then as we talk about it and look at it, we'll see how to navigate through it. So we're in talking about the daily workflow, we're going to talk about it as kind of the life cycle of an order. So imagine that you're ordering a material. You're going to start by selecting it, figuring out what it is you plan to order. After selecting it, your next step is going to be to actually purchase it, to find the vendor that has it, figure out how much it costs, tell the vendor you'd like it, have them send it to you, and then you pay for it, or some version of that. They will send it to you and you will receive it. And that will begin the process of getting it into your catalog and onto your shelves and available for your patrons. And at some point in here, sometimes it's at the same time, sometimes it's a little before, sometimes it's a little after, you'll get an invoice. And this is basically the final amount that you must pay for this item that you've received or that you did pay. And it varies a little bit between each vendor. Again, a circle is not a perfect metaphor for this process. Evergreen has a tool for each step in this cycle. So we're going to look at those, not in a great deal of detail, but we will look at each of those tools. Selection lists allow you to select materials that are already owned by other Cardinal libraries, select materials that are owned by libraries outside of Cardinal, and you can select materials for which no MARC record exists yet. So basically, you can select anything that you plan to purchase. Purchase orders allow you to create accurate summaries of the materials you wish to order, the number of copies, the cost of those copies, and then you can then provide that purchase order to your vendor. And if your vendor has EDI, then you can do that directly within Evergreen. As part of the purchase order process, once you've got it ready to go, you will do a process called activating it. And activating a purchase order automatically encumbers the designated funds. And this is one of the reasons that I think switching to the Evergreen module is helpful, because once you've decided that you're going to order something, then you can automate that process of managing the funding process. So basically, you can automatically encumber the money that is going to be used to purchase these materials. And that's going to help you avoid things like accidentally overspending or forgetting to mark that you ordered 2 copies instead of 1, and therefore having a slight error that throws off your whole budget. Then you can mark the items on that purchase order received as they come in. And doing so will change it from encumbered to debited. So it'll say, you know, this money was not available to spend from this fund. The $23 for this book was not available to spend when it was encumbered, but it hadn't yet been actually removed from whatever underlying account held it. Once it becomes debited, then that money is gone from that account. It's been paid. And then finally, Evergreen allows you to create invoices, to link to invoices provided by your vendor. There are a lot of different ways that you can work with invoices. And this will update the amount within the funds to reflect any changes to the cost. So let's say your purchase order said that an item was going to cost $23, but when it was actually provided to you and you were invoiced for it, it turns out it was only $21. It also allows you to do things like add shipping and taxes and other of those sort of non-direct charges or direct charges that are unrelated to the actual items that you are purchasing themselves, but that are going to come out of your funds nevertheless. So let's look at what some of the tools that will help you to manage this cycle are. And they are all going to be available through the same search interface, which I think is a really nice feature, is that not only are they all kind of there together in a single place, but you can also sort of cross search. So let's look at what that means really quickly. All right, are we seeing the acquisition search screen?
Yep.
Okay. All right, so you can see in this general search, and that's all from the acquisitions menu under general search, you can see that we have 4 tabs. So we can search individual line items, we can search purchase orders, we can search invoices, and we can search selection lists. But what's really fantastic is that if we're under the line item search, we can come here to determine basically what field we're searching. We don't just have to search for line items. We can search, say, for a selection list. So what we're going to get, if we do this, is that we're going to get individual line items. So our results will be whatever the tab is. So we're getting line items, but we're getting them basically by saying, I want to see every line item that is on a selection list owned by admin. So you're able to sort of cross search that way, which is really nice because let's say you have, 15 different selectors in your library system and you want to see every line item that was selected by one of them. And you don't necessarily want to go into each of those selection lists because you're looking for items across multiple selection lists. So rather than searching for all of their selection lists and then going into each of them, you're able to get directly to those line items in a single search, but you're able to make that search based on the selection list owner. And then from there, you can look at the line item in a variety of different environments. You can look at it on the selection list. You can also look at it on the invoice if it's already been invoiced. You can look at it in the catalog if it's in the catalog now. And that's really, I think, a helpful part of the way the search works with an Evergreen. All right. So that's sort of the basics of searching. We'll use it a little bit as we move forward. One thing that I do want to talk about, since we just did a search for a line item, is what is a line item? And I think that's a really important thing to talk about when we talk about acquisitions, because this is really kind of the bridge. The line items are the building blocks that allow you to create everything from selection lists to invoices. They're also the things that connect each of those pieces together. You can have a line item that is on one selection list with a bunch of things, and then it goes onto a purchase order with a bunch of other things that weren't on its original selection list, but it still links that selection list and that purchase order together. And so it really builds a bridge between the different pieces and the different steps of the process. So it's the building block of each step of the daily workflow. One of the things to note about line items is that they include information about the number of copies to be ordered, the cost of each copy, the fund being used to purchase the items, and the distribution of the copies within the system. So in other words, which branches in a system will get a copy of this item that's being ordered, and how many copies will they get? So if you're doing like a community reads where every branch in your system is going to get multiple copies of a book, the distribution basically tells you how many copies each branch gets. And so all of that is going to be represented within the line item. So the line item itself is created from a record, from a MARC record. And you can do this in a lot of different ways. You can pull it directly from the NC Cardinal catalog if it's something that's already owned in the consortium. You can upload it from a file supplied by a vendor. You can pull it from another library or OCLC via Z3950. And it could also be a brief record that you create manually. So there are a lot of different ways to create a line item, but basically it's always starts from a MARC record of some sort. And as I said earlier, it really links between each step. Basically, you create that line item once, and then you move it from one container to the next. And the line item that appears on your invoice is actually the same line item that appeared on your selection list. So as we saw in our search results, this single line item for this book appears on an invoice and a selection list. So I could go into that invoice and see the line item. I could go into that selection list and see the line item. And then what's really nice about line items is because they do work as sort of that building block and that link between each of these steps. If you don't use every step, that's okay, because line items can be created at any point. So no matter how you end up using acquisitions, you will create line items at the point you enter the ordering cycle. So if you don't use selection lists, you don't have to start your line items at the selection list point. You can start them at the purchase order point. If you start from scratch with selection lists, then that's where you'll create those line items, but otherwise you can do it at any other point in the process. Let's look at a line item really quickly. So before we were looking at search results for line items, now we're actually into, right, well, that one is not loading, so let's just go into, all right. This is an opportunity for you to see some other ways that the search works. So let's look at a line item attribute. And that basically means searching for an aspect of the MARC record. Okay, so we are going to take a look at this line item. And at this point, this line item is at the on order from a purchase order phase of the process. But it really doesn't matter which phase it is. There are a lot of things that you'll see in a line item that are going to be the same across every, oh, this was not the one I created. Sorry, basically do the same thing. So one thing that you can do with any line item is that if you click this expand button, then that's going to allow you to see an example, or not see an example, see the actual individual copy information that that goes with this line item. So it's a single line item for 4 different copies. And so you get to see which branch those copies are going to. You get to see if the barcode has already been assigned, if a call number has already been assigned. You get to see which fund it's coming out of. And then you can also see information about other information that's maybe been added to it.
Justin's mentioning with B&T using enhanced EDI, the line item number from Evergreen shows up on packing slips and printed invoices as well.
Yeah, that's a super useful feature because it allows you to really pinpoint exactly where you can find different line items as they're coming in. And so that's another reason that using Evergreen really kind of streamlines your ability to communicate with your vendors and to sort of integrate vendor communication into the process of acquisitions. So a couple of other things that you'll always see in a line item. If you take this link to the catalog, this is going to show the item within the catalog if it exists. So within the NC Cardinal catalog, if it exists. This one doesn't because it was deleted. This is really old. This is from 2014, I think. I created one for the same book. Yeah, 2014. So that would take you into the catalog, the existing catalog record in NC Cardinal. Now, if this was based off of, say, a brief record or something like that that doesn't exist in NC Cardinal, then this option would be slightly different. Another thing that that can be really useful depending on what your record keeping looks like is the worksheet. This takes you into basically a printable version of what you see in that expanded line item so that you can print this out or save it as a PDF as part of your records. One thing that you'll see a lot of when you're working on the acquisitions is this return button. So rather than going through the back button, you'll hit the return button to get back to where you were. Sometimes it takes a minute to load.
And these screens here are also the ones like with the return buttons are ones that a lot of these are getting updated. So you'll see those disappear in future versions.
That would be great. Let's see some other things that you can see here. If the book has already been invoiced, then you'll be able to view the invoice directly from here. Another thing that you can do is if it's on a selection list, then you'd be able to see that selection list too. Another thing you can do is select a single line item from a larger thing, such as a selection list or a purchase order. And you can come up here to the actions menu. And there are a variety of actions that you can perform on that line item. So you could basically export a list of ISBNs. So you could select an entire purchase order or an entire selection list and export that list. You could print it, things like that. But in terms of the actual line items, you could cancel just that line item. So you don't have to cancel an entire purchase. You can cancel just one item, assuming it's in a cancelable state. You can apply a claim policy. So that's one of the things that we'll get into more detail about when we're talking about administrative setup in a future session is claim policies. You can mark things as received. So that's sort of that later step in this process is marking items as received. And you can also unreceive them. You can create invoices. There are a lot of things you can do with individual line items. So line items are sort of the building blocks. We're going to take a look now at the things you can build with them. So the first thing we'll look at is selection lists. So now this is something that not every library uses. It's really useful, I think, when you have a very large library, when things are not centralized in terms of purchasing, or if purchasing is centralized but selection is not, because it does help with communication. But it's up to you whether or not you want to use them. Essentially, selection lists are the first step in your selection list is to choose your items. And so a selection list is really a list of items that you plan to order. It also includes the quantities of those items that you plan to order. So you might have a list of titles, but then you also need to know the number of copies of each of those titles you plan to order. I do not know the answer to the question about Oracle in the chat right now, but that's something that we can certainly look into. So you've got your titles of the items you're ordering, the quantities. You also need to know the distribution. If you've got a multi-branch system, which branches are getting a copy of this and how many copies. And then a selection list is also the point where you will determine which fund will be paying for these materials. So, if you have a fairly straightforward system where an adult fiction book is going to be paid for from the adult fiction fund, then that's fairly simple, but you do need to set it before you can move forward from the selection list point. We'll look very briefly at a selection list. Let's hope this one loads. All right, so this is a selection list. And you can see that each of the items in here or that only one of the items in here has a copy attached to it. So I could come in here, I would need to come in here and actually add copies to Unicorns Are the Worst in order to move this selection list forward and create a purchase order from it. I'm not actually going to do that right now. We'll get into more detail about how to do that in our daily workflow session in the future. But a couple of other things to note here. We also have the expand option, which allows you to basically see which branch is purchasing it and which fund it's coming from and all that. And we have those same things that we had before. And the line item we looked at, we've got the catalog link, and this is not on a purchase order or an invoice or anything, so we don't have those links available. Some things that you can do with the selection list, depending on how selection works at your library, you can mark this ready for a selector. So say people from different departments put together lists and then a single person approves those lists. When a list is ready for that approval level, it can be marked for the selector. Once the selector has approved it, it can be marked ready for order, and the person who's in charge of actually putting forth orders would take it from there. And then, of course, you can do all those things that you would want to do in terms of deleting and things like that. And then you can also turn it into a purchase order. And that's what I'm going to do right now. I'm only going to do it for a single item, though, because we only have one item that's actually ready for that. So we are going to add to purchase order. And oh, I don't remember the name of the purchase order I was going to use. I apologize for that. We'll do that in a second. So the purchase order itself is kind of the next step. This is the part where you put together what you're going to submit to your vendor. And there are a lot of different ways to do that. We're not going to go into detail on them today, but essentially you can do it manually. You can do it from the selection list, or you can do it via EDI if your vendor's set up for that. So there are a lot of different ways to do that. The purchase order itself contains a number of different details. And those details we'll take a look at when we actually look at a purchase order. And then once everything is ready to go, in order to move it to the next step, you will activate it. And one of the most common tickets that we get related to acquisitions is purchase orders that won't activate. I will warn you of that. The process of activating basically means that the library is signing off on their end of the purchase agreement, and they have a final list of items to order, including the number of copies and the funds they will pull from to pay for the order. And that means that every element of the order does need to be finalized before you can activate it. So that's often where the problem is. If you're using EDI, then activating the order actually submits the order and initiates the communication with the vendor. If you're not using an EDI, then while you still have to submit it manually to your vendor, activating it will mark the items as on order. So that means they're going to show up in your catalog as on order, and it encumbers your funds. So that helps to ensure that you're not overspending, because those funds will be encumbered as soon as you decide you're going to move forward with your order. So let's take a look at a selection list. We're going to go back into our general search. We're going to go to the selection list search, and That was the name of the selection list I was looking, or the purchase order I was looking for. Oh, sorry. I'm in the... So we're going to look for a purchase order owned by me. And we are going to filter it to get the most recent ones up here. And we're going to go into it. And so this is a purchase order that is ready to be activated, which means everything in it, which is still loading, is ready to go. So I could go ahead and activate the order. I've got a couple of different options for activation. I can activate it. I can also activate it without loading items. So when you activate the order, one thing that'll happen is that all those MARC records can be loaded in to Evergreen, which is really helpful. You could choose to do that without loading the items. There may be instances where that's a great idea. I'm still not sure what those instances are. In this case, this particular purchase order does not actually have any line items on it. So in order to activate it, I would have to click this box to allow activation with 0 copy line items. Again, this is a situation that's going to be really rare. It might happen in a case where you're going to be paying some direct charges once it gets to the invoice stage, but you want to put forward the purchase order first for record keeping. But it's something that doesn't happen very much at all. One thing that a couple of things to look at in this details section is up here. You'll get an information about the estimated cost of the entire purchase order, and that could change between ordering and invoicing, the total amount that's encumbered and the total amount that's spent. And what's going to happen is that when you first activate it, the total encumbered will be the same as the total estimated. As you receive items and you mark them received on the purchase order, then those received items will add up to go into the total spent. So your total spent then, your total spent plus your total encumbered should add up to about your total estimated, but of course your final charges may be a little different. But this gives you just like that really quick overview of how much this is going to cost, how much has it already cost, and how much do we still expect to spend. All right, and so the final piece is invoices. So we've looked at purchase orders and selection lists. The final thing is the invoice, which is going to come basically as your final bill. And again, just like purchase orders, these can be manual. They can also be made from purchase orders, or in a lot of cases, they will happen automatically via EDI. And they have a spot for direct charges. So these are things like shipping and taxes that kind of come out of the funds, but they're not associated with a line item. And one of the nice things is that you can actually prorate those direct charges. So if you have an order that maybe is coming out of 3 different funds, you can choose to prorate the tax on that order so that each fund is debited the relative amount of tax that it should be, as opposed to, sticking all of the tax into one fund, which is a little bit unfair to that fund. So you do have the option to prorate it. So we will look briefly at an invoice. Let's come back to our search. And this time we're going to go to our Invoices search tab. And we are going to just look. If that's okay with that. And so basically an invoice is going to have information about the line item. It's going to have information about how much that line item was billed, and it's going to be how much it was paid. And those 2 things will happen together. So as you put in the amount billed, the paid will automatically update. And then down below, you have your direct charges. So those are sort of put in separately. At the top, you've got a bunch of details about the invoice. One of the things to note is that there is a section here for receive method. So there are two options for receive method. There's EDI and there's paper. EDI is for EDI. Literally everything else is paper. Even if you get it as a PDF in an email, it's still counted as paper. One thing that you can also do at this point is search for line items that you can add into an invoice, which is useful. All right, so that is basically it. As I said, we really weren't going to dive into too much detail on any one thing. It's more of an overview of how it all fits together. So what are the key things that you should remember from this? One is that all libraries engage in acquisitions, and Evergreen helps to automate that process. You're already doing it. Evergreen just kind of helps you to make it a little bit smoother. Evergreen acquisitions includes a variety of tools that can be combined in lots of different ways that meet your library's needs. There's not a one-size-fits-all way to use acquisitions. It primarily is divided into two distinct workflows: administrative setup and the daily workflow. And line items are the workhorses of acquisitions. They really are the thing that kind of link from one step to the other. And that's really, I think, your basic introduction to acquisitions. As I said, we are going to be looking at a variety of future options for sessions for this. Let me put this link into the chat. This is a survey that will help us to understand what it is that you need. I'm pulling up this link.
Pat, I can answer your question here in just a minute. Should I go ahead and go for it, Samantha?
Yes.
Okay. So ancestors and descendants, that has to do with when you are searching for what we call an organizational unit. So you might think of it as the name of a library system or the name of a library branch. If you, for instance, search for your branch, you could say ascendants, and that would be all of the things that are sort of above that in the organizational chart. So if you search for a branch and say ascendants, it would also show you the name of your library system and anything that was relevant to that. If you search for your library system name and you chose descendants, then it would show you everything under that, which allows you to not just search for things that were done at the system level, but any of the branches as well. So that is especially what you might find useful when searching for using the ascendants or descendants, is putting in your system name and then saying descendants, and that way you can catch any POs that were in any branch or any orders or any of that kind of thing. Does that make sense? Going to Mary's question, you have thoughts on that, Samantha? I'm happy to offer an opinion if not.
I think there are a couple of different things you could do for that. The thing is, you would have to have funds and funding sources set up in order to do that, because you can't really work. The point that would happen would be at purchase orders, and you can't really work with purchase orders without funds. To that end, you could set up a fairly generic fund just for the sake of having it, so you could do the purchase orders. It'd be pretty easy to do. But if you're going to do that, you may as well do it the full way, so you know the real money that's being spent. It's not that much harder to do that, but you can do it where really all you're doing is purchase orders. And then I would recommend that you still mark things received in order to kind of move them along properly in the system. But you can do just purchase orders. You don't have to do the rest of it. But you do have to set up funds in order to make purchase orders functional. Benjamin, you may have a completely different opinion than me.
I was just going to say, if you want, the other option is you don't have to do any of this sort of acquisitions accounting or using the acquisitions module at all. If you're just using the cataloging mark batch import export, not really tracking if and when and how things show up and are ordered and are paid for and all that stuff, which is acquisitions does. You can, if you just get a file from your vendor, either upload just the marks or the mark records and the holdings, which has the information about the individual items and that sort of thing. And that doesn't provide you any kind of accounting, but it in terms of all of the functionality that acquisitions offers, but it does allow you a way to get either just the mark records or the mark records and the individual holding information about the copies if you just want to go through the mark batch import export functionality. So kind of depends on what your purposes are. Do that now, but it's way later than when the items are actually placed on order. Okay, so it's also possible to load those as on order records. Load the mark files from the on order records. I think the trick is when you go back later and update those records, and actually when you actually receive the items and put the replace the dummy barcodes and that kind of thing. So that may be where acquisitions comes in useful.
So there's a question about patron requests, and the thing about patron requests is that it's not automated yet. So a patron request would not then immediately start some sort of purchasing cycle. So you can utilize the patron request thing without using the rest of acquisitions by just going to the acquisitions menu and going to the patron request option in it. And then you put in the patron's home library and then you create a request. And so you could do that and just kind of use that as a place to keep those requests centrally accessible to all of your staff. And then when somebody is going into placed orders, then they can use this as one of their tools for selection without necessarily having to use the rest of acquisitions in order to do it. Like I said at the beginning, there's lots of tools in acquisitions and you can use as few or as many of them as works for you. And if this is the only one you're interested in, then it definitely could work without using the rest of acquisitions, because it's not fully integrated in an automatic sense with the rest of acquisitions at this point. That is something that's probably coming in a future upgrade. No, at this point, I don't think it automatically places the hold, although I could be wrong. Yeah, it does. It does.
Oh,
sorry.
That may be new to 3.9, because I remember us talking about that as we were going through the draft training stuff.
I think it was in 3.8 actually. There was some acquisition stuff in 3.8. So I think that's where that's coming. It still isn't automated in the sense that it automatically starts creating a purchase order or add something to a selection list. But I believe you could place the hold here. It's something that I'd want to play around with before I give you a definite answer on how that would work.
And I seem to remember there was one thing that would say, hey, you should go place a hold, but didn't actually place a hold. And maybe that's what that checkbox does. I'm not sure. Pat, we'll go back to your question here in a second.
I'm not sure how much information I have to put in here to make it savable. I'll play around with this and I'll get back to you on that, Murray, and let you know if I can get a better answer for you.
Can I go back to Pat's question, Samantha?
Yeah.
Sure. So the explanation of ascendants and descendants, basically, if I remember correctly, Pat, you're from Cumberland. So an example would be if you put in Spring Lake and said include ascendants, then that would also include the Cumberland County Library and anything that was done at that level. Descendants works the other way around. So if you said you put in Cumberland and then said descendants as well, it would include Bordeaux, Clifland, or Cliffdale, Hope Mills, Spring Lake, all this. So it would be everything that is below that in the organizational chart. So, the way that we have systems and organizations set up in Cardinal is there's a system level and then there's branch levels. So if you say descendant and you put in a system, and it will include all of the branches as well. Or if you put in a branch and choose ascendant, it will put in the system and Cardinal as well. So it's a way to kind of not only search just one thing, but other things that are related to that one thing, so that you can search all of your branches at the same time and not just a single branch and have to flip between branches or something like that. Does that make sense? All right. Other questions?
Well, if there are no more questions right now, I definitely encourage you to feel free to reach out to me if something pops in your head in the future. Put it on Basecamp. If you are in the acquisitions list, that's a great place for it. If you're not and you'd like to be, put in a request to get added to it. We're happy to add you to that. And as has been mentioned a few times, there are some things within this module that we expect to see change in forthcoming upgrades. So, it does a lot right now. We're hoping that we see even more automation in the future. It is a very, very, very big set of tools. And so it can seem a little overwhelming getting started. So the idea of this was really just to kind of get your feet wet. If you are interested in moving forward, then we will get information about future sessions out soon. So thank you so much for being here today.